Now we are moving into the theme of today, which is about change. And when we think about change, the first thing that comes to mind is indeed if we are able to change our whole civilization and make it sustainable. Tomorrow we will go a step further, we will go on to regeneration. But today, let's start with sustainability. And I think that the idea that we need to create a new ecological civilization is the big question of today. And this question we want to address now with Jeremy Lent, who is in the United States, in Berkeley, in California, who is going to speak about this need to change civilization and move all of us into a new era. And later, this will be what we could call the mega approach, because we said yesterday that we use in Delphi the micro mega approach. So the mega approach is going to be Jeremy's talk, but then later this morning, we are going to move to other levels that come closer to us, that come closer to what each of every one of us can do in order to achieve that change and move to sustainability and from sustainability to regeneration. And this is going to be what will guide us this morning in this change session. Because one thing is sure, we have to change. And it is better if we organize the change and if we don't let it happen as it happened with this terrible pandemic that just fell on us and we were unprepared and not able to respond to it in the right way. So I would like to welcome Jeremy Lent. I hope Scott, with the miracle of technology, can find him in Berkeley, in California. Are we with Jeremy now connected?
Yeah, I'm right here, Alexandra.
That's great, Jeremy. Thank you. And thank you so much, because we know it's night for you. It's very late. It's morning for us. It's raining here. It's beautiful weather in Delphi. How is the weather in California?
It's been pretty sunny here too, actually. Yeah. So,
but now it's night. So you don't
about the weather.
Anything.
Right now it's dark out there and the stars are out.
Okay. Yeah. So Jeremy, we will listen to you, and afterwards we will really want to ask our audience, our whole community,
you take notes in between,
to ask questions. Because what we are going to share with us is extremely important, and we would be very happy afterwards to take some time to exchange with you. So please don't only raise your hands, send us questions through the chat. Jochen and I will take them, and then we can go even a little bit deeper after we have heard Jeremy and continue this conversation for the next hour or so. So thank you very much, Jeremy. You can start.
Great. So here we are. I'm going to talk, as Alexandra said, about this vision that has got me and other people very excited about an ecological civilization. But before I begin, obviously something that we're all very aware of right now is the impacts of the coronavirus that we've all been dealing with. And both here in the States and I'm understanding in Europe too, we're beginning to enter this phase of, okay, maybe it's time we can start to sort of move back to some version of sort of steps towards normal, if you will. And I think with that in mind, this I thought was a cartoon I came across the other day, which I thought is very worthwhile taking a look at. You know, as when we're looking at COVID-19, we know that there is no real normal to go back to because it wasn't normal before. And as we move into this next phase, obviously we're all aware we're going to be dealing with a major recession, but far bigger than anything is this looming existential wave of climate change that we all know is coming up in the future. And that's why there's really no such thing as normal that we're looking at right now. And so I want to focus our attention on that first. And I'm sure many people are familiar with this kind of graph about climate change and climate breakdown, which is simply that we know that greenhouse emissions have been going up basically uncontrollably. And even the pledges that countries around the world agreed to in Paris some years back are completely insufficient to get us to where what we need to be doing is going right back down to stay consistent with like a 1.5 degree change in temperature by the end of the century, way lower than even the pledges, and the countries aren't even close to meeting their own pledges. So this is a situation that many, not just activists, but scientists are so aware that if we keep going in this direction over the next years and over the next few decades, we'll be looking at really uncontrollable climate breakdown. Things like these feedback effects, like the loss of the Greenland ice sheet, and ultimately the Earth system moving to a new state, and the serious risk of real civilizational collapse. So this is something we just need to be aware of. But when you look at this situation, it's so much bigger than climate change itself, so that even if we could somehow magically find some way to deal with greenhouse gas emissions, we're looking at a far greater degree of ecological breakdown across the board. And so if we just spend a moment to think about our home. Here's the Earth in space, the only place we know of in the universe that has life, where humans for the last couple of 100,000 years have become the dominant species and affecting the Earth in dramatic ways, more than almost any other species in the history of billions of years of Earth. And what have we been doing in that role of stewardship? Well, it's been really a dismal failure what we have been doing as we're meant to steward the Earth. We're looking at half of all marine life lost in the last 40 years. We're looking at the rainforests basically disappearing. Since 1970, we've been seeing a 60% decline in animal populations all around the world. And even beyond animals, insects populations are collapsing around the world in all different parts of the world. Monarch butterflies here in California are down like 98 to 99% of their previous population. The vast ecological destruction just keeps going on each different place we look across the board. It's expected by the UN that 5 billion people will be facing water shortage by the middle of this century. We are right now experiencing the beginning of the 6th great extinction of species in all of Earth's history of billions of years. Only this one is different from the others because it's caused by us, by human beings. The coral reefs are on track to become totally annihilated this century worldwide. And it's expected that 95% of Earth's land will be degraded by the middle of the century. And then of all the statistics that I find it hardest to get my head around is this one, that by 2050, there will actually be more plastic in the ocean by weight than fish. So all this is going on at today's level of production. And of course, right now, we're hitting this recession with the coronavirus. But of course, all the mainstream economists and businesses want to get us back on this track so that the expectation by mainstream finance is that global production will be tripling by the year 2060 from what it is now. So if we look at the destruction that's taking place right now, how can the Earth bear 3 times more production, 3 times more consumption of resources? And that's why we have to be aware of this possibility that at some point over the next few decades, we might be looking at some kind of magazine cover asking this kind of question. So this, obviously, none of us want to see a collapse of our civilization. But one thing we can know for sure is that this century, we are undergoing transformational change. As Alexandra said, if we look at the theme of change, this is what we're experiencing this century. And in fact, the changes that we're undergoing this century have really so dramatic that there has only really been a couple of times in history, in all of humanity's history, that we've seen a transformation so vast as we're actually experiencing right now. And these are some of the big stages in all of human history that we can see, from hunter-gatherer to agriculture to the scientific revolution. Now, in the book that I wrote called The Patterning Instinct, A Cultural History of Humanity's Search for Meaning, I looked at some of the underlying drivers of these big changes in human history, in the way that humans make sense of the world, all the way from hunter-gatherer times onwards. And one thing I distilled from the years of research I did in this book is this simple statement that culture shapes values all through history, and those values are what shape history. And in fact, if you look at those big transitions from hunter-gatherer to agriculture, etc., what we see is there were transformations in fundamental systems of values each time one of these big changes happened. And I'm going to take you through just a very high-level version of some of these changes that happened historically to give us some context so we can understand the kinds of possible changes that we need right now in this century. So first, just to spend a few moments looking at the hunter-gatherer set of values. And we as humans spend 95% plus of our history as nomadic hunter-gatherers. And for hunter-gatherers, their sense of nature was that nature was a giving parent. They lived in a world without boundaries, and they saw all living beings all around them as basically being family. They sensed that we all have an intimate relationship with the spirits that were in everything all around them. And with that sense of nature being a given parent, they sensed that we could trust nature to meet our needs, that everything is connected, and that the natural world has intrinsic value. So these are the kind of value systems that we as humans lived all around the world for most of our history, but then that all changed about 10,000 years ago with the rise of agriculture. Now, when that happened, we started to experience for the first time a sense of separation. I like to use this fence as an iconic image for what agriculture meant to the human experience, because it meant separation, not just humans separating their agrarian fields from nature, but also humans being separate from other humans. As some people worked harder or got lucky with their crops, they got wealthier than other people. And so hierarchies started to develop. And as that happened, different wealth itself became a value, and different ways of thinking entered into the human experience. So these hierarchies that agriculturalists had translated into a way of making sense of the universe being like a hierarchy of the gods. And along with that came the sense of the intrinsic value of things like wealth, possessions, and power. And the sense, because of the ways in which you'd have floods and crops would fail, there was a sense you can't trust the gods. You need to worship, sacrificed, and a priesthood developed to mediate between people and the gods up there. And there was ultimately this sense of that you had to respect the hierarchy, and just as important, the patriarchy. In fact, it was with the rise of agriculture that we see the rise of the patriarchy, where women became the property of the male, objectified sexually, excluded from power, and silenced in the public sphere. And all agrarian civilizations around the world lived according to these set of values, even with all their differences, until just a few hundred years ago with the rise of the scientific revolution. And of course, as we know, that happened in just in one place in Europe. And with the scientific revolution came a new way of looking at nature, seeing nature being a machine. And along with that came this vision of the possibility of the conquest of nature, with people like Francis Bacon, like one of the prophets of the scientific age, talking about how we can establish and extend the power of dominion of the human race itself over the universe and render ourselves the masters and possessors of nature. And the Europeans, along with this belief of conquering nature, also sensed that they could conquer other continents, which led to the rise of imperialism and colonialism, and the initiation of this white racist ideology that has become dominant through much of the world. Along with that came the genocide of the indigenous peoples in North and South America, and then enslavement and transportation over the centuries of more than 12 million Africans to the United States and to North and South America to be slaves there. And these were the historic underpinnings of our modern dominant system of values. So if we take a moment and look at what is the modern story tells us about our values, it's really a story of separation. It tells us that nature is a machine, that humans are separate from nature. Humans are separate from each other. It tells us that human progress arises from the conquest of nature and that earth is a resource to be used for our benefit. And ultimately, with all of that, the purpose of life is basically to get wealthy and powerful. So this is a worldview based on separation. And I view an image like this as really being iconic of our world today, where we're even standing there in lines pre-COVID. We're like separate from each other because we're just connected to the technology. We're separate from our food sources. And it's the media who gives us this barrage of information telling us about this root story, even when we think that they're just telling us anything else about the world. So if you just imagine a typical situation, we turn on the news, the TV, and we hear a newscaster telling us about what's happening in the economy today. What she's really telling us, along with all the rest of the media, is this underlying story of separation. What she's really telling us is that we're all separate from each other, that we're all selfish. And by the way, it's really great that we're all selfish, because through everyone acting selfishly as rational maximizers, that's the way capitalism works, and that works for the best interests of everyone. And we're told that nature is a machine. And that's actually a really good thing, because technology is the solution to all of our problems. And somehow through technology, we can grow infinitely on a finite planet. And ultimately, the ultimate message we're being told all the time is that really everything is meaningless. And so because of that, we should just fill it all with consumerism. And this is a system that is designed incredibly well to mint new billionaires. It's a system that has allowed the global transnational corporations to dominate our world. So that now 69 of the world's 100 largest economies are actually transnational corporations, not countries. And it's a system that's led to the greatest inequality in history, where at this point, believe it or not, the wealthiest 26 billionaires own as much wealth as half the entire world's population. And this is a system that has led to us ransacking the earth, the last minerals, the last resources available, even so that even while we're having climate breakdown, we're still putting out more excess fossil fuels and carbon into the atmosphere, causing this existential crisis of climate breakdown. And this is why clearly there's this concern of this possibility of some kind of collapse of this system in the future. But having looked at this context, I want to take us through this possibility of transforming this system into something very different, transforming it into a positive and a potential for a flourishing future, which would mean turning around this very underlying basis to something that I and other people call the possibility of an ecological civilization. So what is an ecological civilization? It's about transforming the basis of our global civilization from one that's wealth-based to one that is life-based. And along with that is a complete global cultural economic system that promotes sustainable flourishing for humans and Earth. Now, the reason we call it an ecological civilization is because some of the principles of it are based on actually the principles of ecology. So ecology is really the study of how living systems self-organize. And the amazing thing about ecologies is when they're left alone from human domination, they can remain resilient for millions of years, adapt to all the changes that happen, and stay strong, resilient, and healthy. And so the concept is to build a civilization on this principle. And the underlying principle, the underlying story of this civilization is that we are all interconnected in the web of life. And I'm going to take you through some of the principles of what that actually means at the next level down. So just really quick touch on some of what these things we were looking at. One is a sense of diversity. Ecologies are always diverse, and they, just like all these different animals at the watering hole, an ecological civilization would respect the dignity of all peoples and all groups and recognize the inherent right of every person to participate in political and economic power. And ecologies work through this concept of symbiosis, where each party contributes and receives reciprocally, just like in this image. The crocodile is happy to have the bird pick the little worms out of its teeth. And so the different kinds of organisms in the ecology can work together for the common good. And crucially, ecologies work well through this notion of a holarchy. And what a holarchy is, some of you are familiar with this concept of fractals, where patterns repeat themselves at larger and larger scales. And the holarchy is basically the whole connected set of all the different patterns that will repeat themselves all the way to the complete whole. And the whole crucial element of this holarchy is that the health of the whole requires the flourishing of each part within it. That's a crucial element for an ecological civilization. Another principle is known as locality, where we'd be looking at societies organized based on their bioregions, rather than this kind of globalized system where we like ship products all around the world just for the convenience of consumerism. Instead, we'd be looking at regions having different needs and affinities based on their ecological context and connecting with the land rather than with global flows. Another principle is this notion of embeddedness, recognizing humanity as being part of the natural world. This was a slogan in Paris during COP21. We are not fighting for nature, we are nature defending itself. And then along with that comes the sense of regenerative civilization, that everything we do is for sustainable flourishing into the long-term future. There's this great quote from the Iroquois Confederacy, one of the Native American tribes, saying, in our every deliberation, we must consider the impact of our decisions on the next 7 generations. Along with that comes the sense of humility, recognizing the unpredictability of complex systems and that human activity affects the entire system in nonlinear and unexpected ways. So with these principles, I'll just want to drill down one level more and take a real quick scan as to what an ecological civilization might actually mean in practice, actually applied to the world this century. Well, first off would be this notion that corporations, those transnational corporations that dominate so much of our world today, would be transformed to exist for humanity rather than for shareholder returns. Now, right now around the world, there's a new innovative notion of benefit corporations, or B Corps, where the corporation itself is chartered, so the board is asked to consider its impact of its decisions on not just shareholder wealth, but things like workers, customers, suppliers, community, and environment. And over 3 companies worldwide have changed their charter to become benefit corporations. But in an ecological civilization, we would actually see the transnational corporations fundamentally reorganized. So they'd have to have what's known as a triple bottom line required for their charters. A triple bottom line meaning not just profit, but also people and planets. And along with that would come strict limits on advertising, which is often used to basically condition people to become essentially consumer zombies. In an ecological civilization, we'd see worker-owned co-ops becoming the major force in global commerce, which are naturally inclined towards ecological values, such as equity and fairness. And we'd see a significant reduction in global income inequality, with a just transition from the fossil fuel economy, the imposition of a global wealth tax to become, to let our society become somewhat fairer, and having a universal basic income so that people have enough, know they have enough to rely on for their basic dignity, and the return of much of the property that's now been privatized back to the commons. We'd be looking at a circular economy which can increase employment while reducing waste, where products are designed for repair and recycling and sourced from recycled materials, which can lead to the virtual elimination of waste. We'd be looking at cities designed on ecological principles, with like community gardens on every block and extensive use of energy efficient designs and cars banned from city centers. And out of cities, we'd be looking at agroecology, replacing the global industrial monocrops that have been so devastating on our earth. And this would be based on permaculture principles with greater crop biodiversity, far greater water and carbon efficiency, and elimination of synthetic fertilizer. And to measure how this economy is doing, rather than GDP, which really just is a simple measure of how quickly and efficiently we're consuming the earth and taking the resources and turning it into the monetized economy, we'd be looking at replacing that measurement by any number of different measurements that are out there, such as a genuine progress indicator, for example, which factors in negatives, such as income inequality and pollution as a negative, and then looks at the positives like volunteer work and household work and education to really get a sense of what the quality of life is like. And then at the level of global governance, we'd be looking at, just like we have a UN Declaration of Human Rights, a UN Rights of Nature, putting the natural world on the same legal standing as humanity, with personhood being given to ecosystems and rivers and high-functioning mammals, as is already being done in places around the world, and defining the concept of ecocide, the destruction of a whole ecology, as an international crime. And there's already an organization that's working on trying to make that happen. Now, many of you may be hearing some of these ideas and saying, well, great ideas, but it's so far from our reality right now. How can we really take that as a serious plan for where we could be going? So I just want to give you a sense of some of the ways in which cultures can transform way more rapidly than we expect, in ways that are very non-linear, which gives us hope for what's possible. And just to take a look at a couple of examples, when people talked about women's suffrage back not much more than 100 years ago, it was considered to be absolutely outlandish when Emmeline Pankhurst founded the National Union for Suffrage in England for women. She had to fight for decades just to get 3,000 people to march for the women's right to vote in London in 1907. And it was only a couple of decades later that women got the right to vote in the UK and the US, followed by other countries around the world. Similarly, with civil rights in the United States, it was in 1955, Rosa Parks was arrested for refusing to give up her seat on the bus in the United States, and with a bus boycott that lasted over a year, with Black churches burned. Within 10 years, it was Martin Luther King with a March on Washington, with 200,000 people, with his vision of I Have a Dream, and Civil Rights Act passed into law just a year later by President Johnson. This is the amazing way in which nonlinear change can happen. And more recently, back in August 2018, as many of you know, Greta Thunberg was skipping school to begin a solitary demonstration by himself outside the Swedish parliament. Just 1 year later, and there's 4 million plus school children on a global climate strike, and the climate emergency being declared by not just by nationalities in over 1,000 jurisdictions worldwide. And the reason why we see some of these changes happen so dramatically is that public support follows a non-linear path of change. And so the way that happens is there's this kind of long, slow, early adoption phase when there's what's known as ideological lock-in. People stick with received ideas and attitudes. There's social rigidity, inertia. People say, it'll never happen. And then a tipping point begins to happen with a crescendo of change when a few influential thought leaders start attracting increasing numbers towards these new ideas. And that same stickiness that kept people back there not accepting change starts to pull people into this new direction as a sort of herd instinct. People want to follow these new ideas that look exciting. And before you know it, there's widespread adoption and you're hitting a new stable state where those new ways of thinking become institutionalized. And there's always some diehard reactionaries, but now they're in the minority. And then everyone looks back and says, oh, it was inevitable. And so if we apply that to these seemingly far out ideas of an ecological civilization, well, what do we see? Well, one thing we see is the magnitude of the crisis we're facing right now leads to the expectation that there will be this tipping point, the climate emergency, the global inequality, the environmental collapse, and the breakdown, as we're all seeing around the world only too clearly, of political norms. And then there's also the rise of the internet, which allows new ideas to be far more speedily transmitted than ever before, and this emergent global sense of the shared humanity that we see so much in what we're sharing with today. And at the same time, the challenge for this change to happen is vast. We have to see this change happen, not just in hundreds or thousands of years, like some of these other great transitions that humans have experienced, but in just a few decades. And we have to do it consciously. As a global human brain, basically, we have to change the way we're thinking, change our values, change our behavior. And to make this change happen would represent basically a unique achievement in human history. And when we look at how we can make that happen, to go back to those learnings I was sharing with you before from the patterning instinct, that culture shapes values and values shape history. So similarly, our values, the values that we have today, will shape the future. And looking at what we mean by that, these are the transformation in values that we're talking about here at in this kind of gathering that we need to see moving around the world. An emphasis on the quality of life rather than material possessions. Prioritizing progress in quality, not quantity. Basing our political and social and economic choices on a sense of our shared humanity with justice and dignity for all. And then building civilization's future on the basis of environmental sustainability, where the flourishing of the natural world is a foundational principle. And so as we have this, as we go into a discussion right now, and then through later today and tomorrow, I encourage each of you to think about those transformation values that would be required to get to where we would want to go, and ask yourself about how that flows into these different aspects of the Delphic cubes in terms of democracy, inner transformation, education, sustainability, how that flows to technology and science and the arts. And as we do that, let's bear in mind what I think is one of the most inspiring comments of all about what is truly possible for something like this, from Margaret Mead, who said, "Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it is the only thing that ever has." So thank you for bearing with me as I took you through that. And now what I'd love to do is open our forum up now for a discussion conversation. If anybody has any questions about what they heard, I'd love to answer that. And really, let's kind of share the space together as part of our interconnectedness. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much, Jeremy. It was great to share this important visionary thoughts with us. And here we have the cube, the 6 sides of the cube. Thank you for referring to it. As you can see, they are not mixed up yet. This is the challenge, to mix up the different disciplines with each other. That's what we are really about to do. And I want to share a quote that Bénédicte Magnier put into the chat. She quotes Victor Hugo, and it fits perfect to your last words. There's nothing more powerful than an idea which time has come. And we know that this idea has come. And now let's go into the questions and into the participation. I would propose, well, we maybe start. Is there anybody raising its hands right now?
Yes, Jochen, I've got Stefanos who would like to ask a question.
Let's go for it.
So Stefanos, I'm going to give you your audio permissions, and if you could then speak, I'll be able to find you on the screen. Here you go. If you could speak now.
Thank you very much. It's a wonderful event. I'm connecting from Bangkok, and I really enjoyed last night and also today. So Jeremy, thank you very much for the presentation. My question is that, you know, I'm at least on what I will call the Western society, Europe, the United States, the concept of ecological civilization has been mostly perceived within the lens of ecological modernization, which is a completely different thing, because ecological civilization is an entire philosophy for a new development paradigm. Ecological modernization is more or less the application of what we know in the economy, the technology, with a little bit of green. And this has led, and I agree with the criticism on the ecological modernization, has led on greenwashing. At the same time, and just from a historic perspective, ecological civilization concept started in the Soviet Union. It gained prominence in China within the Communist Party. And what you described, for it to happen, it needs an entire new governance philosophy. So what do you think it will take the Western governance systems, the republicanism, to make ecological civilization a practice from a concept? Thank you very much.
Yeah, yeah, thanks. A great question. And thanks for giving that global perspective. Well, I think what is key to understand is this, the idea of an ecological civilization, and not just that one sort of phrase, but so many of the different ideas that are coming from around the world. They're looking at different ways of structuring society and the economy. Are as different from, they're really leaving behind the old divides between sort of capitalism and communism, if you will. And I think that the notions we're talking about are just as different from the sort of state authoritarian kind of models of Chinese or Soviet communism as they are from modern global capitalism. And that's one of the things I really try to emphasize whenever I'm having these kind of discussions. This is a totally new way of thinking. It leaves behind some of those polarities, and it leaves behind really some of the presumptions for how things are structured. It's not about taking away power from the private corporation and giving it to the state. And to answer your question more specifically, it's about bringing governance down to the lowest effective level, as close to the grassroots as possible, where that power can be used effectively. There's a concept that's known as subsidiarity, which basically relates to that very notion of devolving power to the most effective level. And that's the way colleges work. I mean, when it's not like there's one sort of grand design, which some sort of ecological dictator who tells the different animals and plants and fungi what they're meant to be doing, but each different community and each different element does what it does optimally in symbiosis and reciprocity with the rest of what's going on around. So similarly, we'd be looking at communities that are on the land, responsible for growing their own products, responsible for their own production, responsible for their own culture, having much more of their own choices that they're making while being part of the global governance of what we need as humanity is to have much more of a global rather than a national sense of scale. So a key element in ecologies and a key element in how an ecological civilization could work effectively is known as reciprocal causality, which basically means that the whole, the system as a whole, affects all of the little parts, while all the parts working together actually affect and create the whole. So it's not like a hierarchy where the top tells the bottom what to do, but in this case, the system itself working together creates the whole, which then impacts the different parts. So the way that translates into what an effective civilization would look like is when we're dealing with global issues like climate breakdown, like ecological destruction, we'd be setting principles at the highest global level, but then different communities all around the world would interpret them in their own way that makes meaning for them and would have the authority to regulate, to self-regulate those, as long as they were consistent with these overall global values and principles.
Jeremy, so the next question will be raised by Alexandra.
Actually, we have several questions referring to the role of technology and how much we can rely on new technologies, including, of course, on artificial intelligence, a question by Klaus from Germany, to help us. And whether you see, of course,
so Alexander, I just lost your sound for the last few, the last phrase or two, but then okay. I got the question about technology, and I think it's a great question. So, so for all who asked that, thank you for that. And well, first off, I think what's really important to understand is that, again, when we're looking at an ecological civilization, this is absolutely not a rejection of technology. It's actually an embrace of technology, but it's just like we talked about restructuring corporations. It would restructure the core foundational way of approaching technology to not be technology based on this old vision of conquering nature, but to be based on this vision of life affirming. There's this powerful concept of biomimicry. We're looking at what the amazing technology that nature itself has developed over billions of years and learning from that how to actually develop our own technology in a way that makes more sense. And I think that one of the ways in which we see great technological innovations like the internet, incredibly hopeful, powerful, transformational things. And then we see that get hijacked by these big mega corporations that turn it from being this positive into something that can be positively destructive. And I think a major reason for that is that technology right now is developed within this global capitalist for-profit system. And so when people get these new ideas they want to develop, they're not thinking, how can I do this for the benefit of all life? They're basically thinking, how can I become the next billionaire as fast as possible? So I think what is absolutely crucial is not just develop new ways of thinking about technology as being life-affirming, but look at ways economically of really taking new innovations outside of this global for-profit structure, capitalist structure, and more towards things like the commons. So like things like Wikipedia or other examples of this or like blockchain offers great opportunities for this, where we can actually start to, rather than say, get rid of the old system, actually start to design the new system that's interconnected, life-affirming, human-affirming, actually design it from within the current system, but design it based on a different operating system, an operating system that is actually one of interconnectedness and human values like compassion and altruism and shared trust and respect for each other rather than this old system.
Jeremy, for your answer. I hope the sound works now. So I tried to bring some questions together that are referring to faith communities. One of them was raised by Don Mullen, asking about the importance of Pope Francis Laudatio Si to distribute the values. And there was another question by Hélène Pichon, who is interested how the different religions, monotheisms in particular, can empower women. Because this idea that you raised about ecological hierarchy has to be distributed as quick as possible. And what's the role actually, from your point of view, from your perspective, of faith communities also in relation to empowerment of unequal people? Please go ahead.
Yes, yeah, thanks. Yeah, that's what is so exciting about this notion of an ecological civilization, is that it is a natural alignment with all of the great faith communities all around the world throughout history. Because if you actually look at every one of the great religious traditions, they come from the sense of this deep sense of humanity and the deep reverence of the natural world. And you know what we see with Pope Francis and Laudato Si is an absolute sense of how even monotheistic faith, which has over the last couple of millennia has had all kinds of serious traumas associated with it, can be understood in a way that connects with this notion of nature as an interconnected set of systems and humans as being part of that. And we see that all around the world. So this vision can be interpreted in many different ways. For example, in China, we can see this interpreted in relation to Neo-Confucianism and the rise in modern approaches to Confucianism that look at, again, at this deep interconnectedness of humans with all of life, with the universe. We see that in South America, with this concept there in many and some of the indigenous countries of what is called buen vivir, which means just the literal translation is to live well, but what it means is well-being. And again, it's based on indigenous insights into the intrinsic interconnectedness of humanity with all of life that we looked at, that early hunter-gatherers shared around the world. So in all cases, what's exciting about it is it's not like some big new abstract idea. It's an idea that comes from our evolved humanity, the fact that all of us are life. We're all living organisms connected with life, that its core human values as humans evolved to be unique among primates, their core human values of things like compassion, a sense of fairness, a sense of community, and wanting to actually be ready to even sacrifice a lot about our own individuality for that community. These are the bases of the great world religions. This is the basis of this vision going forward.
Is there another question from the audience? Raising hand?
Yes, we have a question from Jean-Luc. Jean-Luc, I'm going to give you your audio permissions. Okay, and Jean-Luc, there we go. If you could speak now, I'll be able to find you.
Thank you, because I had some troubles to get the sound. Hello, Jeremy. Thank you very much for your very convincing, even fascinating presentation. So I sent a question just about the radical change you suggest to move to this new civilization. When I use the word radical, I refer to the etymology, which means root. It means that we have to completely change, to pluck, I would say, the roots. So my question is, first, is there anything to save in our current roots. Everything has to be plucked. And to what extent we can make this such a dramatic change, radical change, acceptable for everybody on the earth and in a very short period of time. Because when you describe the revolutions in the past, these revolutions took centuries, millenniums to take place. Now we have to do that in a few years, decades. So how is it possible to imagine that we have a capacity to do such a radical change in such a short period of time for the benefit of everybody on the earth? That's more or less the key question.
This is, I think it's such a key question. It's a question that I think, yeah, that I ask a lot myself, and many people involved in this kind of thinking do ask. And what I think is most important to get a sense of to recognize that the times when these radical, these fundamental changes in underlying value systems happen is when the ways in which a society has been going along as before starts to unravel. And there's actually an ecological systems model called the adaptive cycle theory that looks at the different ways in which all different complex systems change over time. And it works from bacteria to all the way to massive ecosystems over millions of years. And they all go through a phase, a growth phase, and then a very stable phase when things are very tightly connected and it's very hard to change much. But then that stable phase begins to get brittle. It stops being so responsive to what's going on outside. And within that phase, you get these irresistible faults begin to develop within it. And then all of a sudden you have what's called a release phase. And you could look at, for example, at a forest, and suddenly there's a forest fire, or like a stock market, which is beginning to crash, and then suddenly there's a crash. And we're seeing this release phase happen in our society as a whole. And the thing is that while it's frightening to see things unraveling, it's like when that tight weave begins to unravel, that the opportunity arises to actually reweave it in a way that actually can make more sense than before. So it's a very tough challenge, because what we need to do is we need to actually see these changes happen before our whole civilization collapses, which would be this absolute disaster. But it has to happen as the civilization begins to move in that direction, and those tight interconnections that seem to make sense before start to get a little bit looser. Take advantage of those to do the reweaving, even while the society is continuing, so that somehow it's sort of reweaving in midair, so that before we know it, there's a new, different kind of structural way of connecting that people are beginning to accept more and more. It's a huge challenge, but I think the only time that it can happen is now. It's when things move closer and closer to this kind of collapse that the actual opportunity for these drastic radical changes becomes more realistic.
Maybe Jeremy, I just put together now, because time is running short, many questions are really kind of asking that question about the little time we have, and they refer to the corona pandemic. So there was the question, for example, do you believe that behavior change for climate action can curb the ecocid curve? So it's a direct reference to how we deal with this pandemic. And I might like to add how metaphoric, how we can maybe learn from the virus, how these ideas that you are putting here, this holistic approach of a new holarchy, how this can go viral. Maybe we can learn from the virus, how we distribute it. And then many people ask the question, the role of women, because isn't it that the inequality that women, to empowerment of women in that process can speed up the process? And I would like to add, as an intendant of an arts festival, where do you see the role for the arts, for that development, for a new, more human society and culture? And is coronavirus a learning that helps us to now make that real change happen?
Yeah. Well, you know, I think what is really fascinating about the coronavirus is how when humanity as a global entity sees a real threat, it's actually amazing and powerful to see how quickly our civilization, our whole global civilization, can transform things that we were told can't even be changed so quickly. So oftentimes what we're told in terms of climate breakdown, when scientists do the analysis and they say, we have to basically reduce our global consumption at this rate and reduce emissions at this rate, and we're going at this rate, and then people say, it's not possible. It can't be done. So we have to come up with more incremental approaches, even if that doesn't actually lead to anything positive. And now you can no longer say that, because we've seen that with just faced with one threat, what we've been told was impossible just happened overnight. So the key question is no longer a notion of it's impossible, but the issue becomes, how can it be done in a regulated and managed way? And how can humans, like obviously as humans, we evolved to respond very immediately to immediate threats. So in our evolution, if there was like a lion suddenly appeared on the horizon, our adrenaline would kick off and we'd like run in the other direction. We know how to respond to threats that are right there in our face. One of the reasons that the climate breakdown threat is so difficult to respond to is because it involves having to sort of get a sense of where things are headed and looking at one particular event and recognizing that it's part of a global pattern, all these kind of things. That's one reason why it's been so hard to get humanity to recognize what we need to be doing. But to your point, what I think is really hopeful and inspiring from this response to COVID is that change can happen. And when it happens, just like the virus can spread so fast, new ideas can spread equally powerfully, especially with the rise of the internet and the power of the internet to enable us to really develop a sense of like a global consciousness. It's really like humanity waking up to our global interconnectedness, really becoming, it's like one step towards becoming a global superorganism. So what we need to do is really link these two things and get people to be aware, just like that cartoon that I showed you at the beginning of this presentation, was that what we've been facing right now is just a tiny little rehearsal for what we have coming in the future, unless we begin to shift our civilization now.
We have to wrap up and close actually, but I want to insist on the question that Johan asked about the role of the arts. Right. We are in an arts festival, and with it also the role of the women, even in one sentence. Just Absolutely. Give us a hint.
Yeah, well, basically, so powerful. All what we need is the arts and shift in media. Because if you remember what I was saying before, it's like the underlying stories that actually affect everything else that goes on. And each different culture has a story. And this story of interconnectedness that would be the foundation for an ecological civilization. This is the story that the arts, the media, and the transformation in the power structure from like the patriarchy to a more of basically a matriarchal and more of a fair and just society for all. These are the very underlying visions and stories that all of our media, all of our imagination has to go into to basically get people who aren't interested in looking at PowerPoint presentations or who aren't going to read 300-page books to get inspired and become part of that transformation we're looking at.